Hey everyone, I just wanted to give you a quick refresher on how to set up your workspace for working with ink. So we have our India ink. Remember, you don't have a ton of it, so we want to conserve what we have. You should have your ink, your palette, water, and paper towels. Of course, your paper that you're working on, and your brushes. So I have two brushes here. They're both round brushes. One is a little bit larger, one is smaller. And to set up your workspace, what you're gonna need to do is take your ink, and I'm just gonna put a bit into one well of my palette. Then I'm gonna put a couple drops into the next one, and just a couple drops here, and maybe one drop here. This is a pretty good little controlled dropper. So what I'm gonna do is make different shades of gray here by adding more or less water. So I want to have one that is completely black, and I'm using a paper cup here so I can pour a little bit easier. If you have something with a spout, that's even better, or like an eyedropper. So I'm adding a little bit of water to this one, and this one. Now from this view, they look like they're pretty much all the same. So what I like to do is test them out and make sure I have a clear view of how diluted they are as I'm working. So I'm going to start with my light color, kind of stir it up, and I'm going to check how dark it is. It's about this dark. Then wash my brush, mix this one up. This is my next darker color. It's not much darker than this one, so I may change that a little bit. And here's my next darker one. Again, not a huge change, so I'm actually going to take some of this and drop it into here to make this a little darker. Take some of this, make it a little darker. So you can adjust your tones as needed. So now this is slightly darker. This should be slightly darker. And then of course my black is going to be my darkest color, and that's what I am kind of working with here. Now as you're working, just keep track of which ones are darker and which ones are lighter. Now, like I mentioned before, a good way of kind of warming up as you're painting is to practice some different strokes. So let's say I want to create just like a ball. I could practice shading it in different ways. So I could start with some hatching, which is where I create lines that sort of all go in the same direction around the ball. I could do some cross hatching. Oh, these are a little bit sloppy here, just getting back into things. And cross hatching is where I have lines going in the opposite direction, so going across to create different tones. And I could also do like a scumbling, which is where I use scribbly motions. These are sort of some of your base textures, and you should be pretty familiar with them. A lot of them are sort of variations off of these basic strokes. So here's scumbling. Gonna add some darker ink and go back in to kind of layer up that texture. And then I'm gonna do one more, and I'm gonna like I said, this is just a warm-up. I'm going to practice stippling. And stippling is where I do a series of small dots to create value. So as I'm building up more and more and more dots, it creates darker tones. So in my piece, I want to be able to use a variety of textures and a variety of tones. So mostly we're focusing on using textures to build value. We're not doing a lot of washes in this project, but if you would like to use some washes, you can. And that's why it's really useful to know how dark your different levels of ink are. This is a little bit too uniform. I'm not paying close enough attention here. So I'm gonna build up this texture a little bit more. Dun, 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 dun. So this is called contour hatching because I am following the shape to create some three-dimensionality with my hatching. This is called cross hatching. And you should be really quite familiar with these terms by now. This is called scumbling or scribbling. And this is called stippling, where we use dots. So it's always good to kind of warm up and practice some of these different textures as you're going. And like I said, make sure you always swatch out what your tones of gray are. From here, like I said, a lot of these kinds of textures can be altered slightly to create new types of textures. So this scumbling texture can be altered to create all kinds of different sorts of leaf kind of textures. Hatching is really good for sort of grassy kind of textures. Stippling is really good for fine detail, maybe rocky textures, things like that. And here are some of the practice pages. This is just a quick review of how we are starting this project. You're going to want to make sure your compositions are how you want them to be. So we talked a little bit about how to create an interesting composition. Be sure to pay attention to the shapes in your piece. You want to have a well-defined foreground, middle ground, and background in your composition. And as you're sketching, you want to pay attention to the values of your piece and how to render some of those lights and darks. Now, you should have a pretty good idea of what your composition is going to be at this point, and you should have your final piece sketched out. But if you don't, you should work on that today and get that finished. And continue with practicing textures. So here I have some texture practice. I was drawing some rocks. I'm trying to draw the same rock over and over. This one I used stippling. This one I used cross hatching. This one I used regular hatching. And this one I'm using sort of loopy scumbling. And for each rock, it ends up creating kind of a different effect. Here's another practice sketch I've done of a landscape. Here's some of my ink practice doing some of the grasses. And here's a sketch that I'm working on that is a rock with following the textures of the water of my source image. So like I said, I really want you focusing on these textures and trying to render them in a unique way using ink. Here's a practice I've done with a tree, and I tried to show the bark just by doing some sort of parallel vertical lines. And the leaves I have done sort of just blobs of texture. Definitely don't try to paint every single leaf you see on a tree. Just think about the overall shape of how the leaves are growing. So that's basically it for now. As always, let me know what questions you have, and good luck with your ink. Make sure that you are conserving your ink. Like I said, between classes, you can cover this with some plastic wrap, or maybe put it into a plastic bag and keep it flat in a safe place so that you can use it between 2 classes, or maybe even on into the next week. Once the ink dries, it is waterproof and can't be reactivated with more water. And it will stain your palette over time, so just be aware of that. It can also stain your clothing and your fingers and your workspace, so just be really careful. Make sure you have plenty of paper towels with you and ways to clean up if you make any messes as you're working, and that you store your ink in a safe place between classes. But this is all the ink you're going to get for this project, so please make sure to conserve it as best as you can. Thanks, guys.